What do you think is India's outlook on the LGBTQ plus community?
I feel like more recently, India has become a lot more accepting and open to the LGBTQ plus community. And that's mainly because of like the generation I'm from, so Gen Z, and social media. And because our generation is so open to it and so in tune with, let's say, the Western world and countries that are more accepting, we've been able to influence the generations above us and like get them to understand more about the community. So it's just become more like accepting and more welcoming for the community itself.
India's outlook in the beginning, around say the 1900s, the 1800s, when the Britishers came in the beginning, was very homophobic. There's no other way to put it. Every gender other than male and female basically was non-existent to everybody. Even though Indians in the very beginning of our own culture were accepting of them, ever since the Britishers came in and essentially took over India, it did become a lot more homophobic and a lot less accepting. But even lately, like if you went before 2019, the Supreme Court never accepted that any gender apart from male and female was a thing in India. It was never non-binary. You couldn't say that in most government sites. In 2019, with more influx of more open-minded judges into the Supreme Court and more pressing lawyers and more people advocating for it, did make a big difference. And for the first time, India is actually accepting of genders other than male and female existing and accepting them officially in India in 2019. So yeah, we have a more positive and more accepting outlook on the LGBTQ plus community in India.
So I think this is a really interesting question, because while we might have a government that's really right-leaning and not friendly to the LGBTQ community at all, we actually have a lot of like LGBTQ stuff ingrained in our culture and in our like just in the way that we function as a society. And so I think while the government might not be so friendly to the LGBTQ community, there might be a lot of disparity between what the community needs and what the government is doing right now. The actual culture and like the way that India as a country was formed and like of how we became Indians and stuff like that, that's actually very conducive to the LGBTQ community. But right now, because of the like socio-political status of everything that's happening, and because of the increased stigma that's come with colonization, that's come with just like inbred racism and the, like patriarchal thinking and stuff like that, it's become less friendly towards the LGBTQ community, and it's become less likely for people to be accepting than it was maybe like 500-600 years ago, which is strange. But also like two main aspects to it, which is the basic, like the first is that obviously politics, which is people, there needed to be like a villain, they needed to create a story, and they needed to create like a sort of enemy, a public enemy that people could look down on and people could like disregard as humans and stuff like that, just to create a distinction between, oh, this is correct and this is incorrect. And like that's one part of it. And then the second part of it is, I think because of the way that it's been introduced into India in recent times, the LGBTQ community in India itself has become so like prominent only in very recent years. And so like because the West had like a very different culture and understanding and way of coming to terms with it, which was that in the 50s there was the Stonewall riot, there was all these things that were happening at that time that slowly like built up tolerance amongst especially older people and stuff like that, and different generations were exposed to it at different times in different manners. And so what ended up happening over there was this culture of tolerance that was slowly built up. But if you ask any of like even my parents and like my grandparents and stuff like that, they didn't have that like ability, they didn't have that like slow progression into acceptance. It was just sort of dumped on them as the media opened up to India. Like in the 90s, the 80s maybe, like the 80s or 90s, suddenly the media opened up to India. Suddenly there was more than one channel on the TV. Suddenly there was like all these TV shows showing liberal things that nobody had been exposed to before. And like it sort of came into this understanding of like party culture and things like that. And that's what became like the understanding of the LGBTQ community largely, is that they were part of this like foreign Western understanding of it. And so I think like especially the older generations in India have a much harder time coming to terms with these things because they just weren't exposed to it beforehand. And but younger generations like ourselves, is what had happened by that time is there were things like YouTube, there were things like Tumblr, there were things like Instagram, where we could like grow up watching people of all of these communities. And so when that happens, I think you're bound to become a lot more tolerant to them because it's just what you think as a kid. It's like, this is normal. Whereas they didn't have that. So India right now, I think, is very dichotomous, very split up, both on the political spectrum and just generationally, where the more like recent generations have a much more like comprehensive and like liberal understanding of things than people from the prior generation. So I think we're progressing towards a more liberal understanding and outlook.
I think India's outlook is progressing towards a more positive outlook, but generally I don't think it's the most positive outlook out there, because the LGBTQ plus community in India is just very repressed, in my opinion, and because of that, the opinions that exist are just also repressed. Yeah, there's not much that's said, and if anything is said, it is pushed underneath the carpet. But I do think that if at all today, if anything is said, it's more positive today. But I think overall it's not the most positive, but it's progressing.
So the thing with India is like it's a complex relationship whenever it comes to LGBTQ plus relationship. If we see currently, me personally being a trans person, legislation wise there's an outlook where a bill just got passed which is supposed to be good for the trans community, and the government itself has proclaimed that it's supposed to be good, it ensures security for the trans community. But as a trans person in India who hasn't changed their legal gender yet, who hasn't gone through medical transition yet, who just came out recently, it becomes extremely difficult for me right now. In fact, it becomes a position where I don't have the place of self-determination at all, amongst many other issues. Now, this is India's current relationship with a fact of the LGBTQ plus community, right? But if we see through history, colonialism set back India by miles when it comes to acceptance and tolerance to LGBTQ plus community. In fact, so there was a British law in 1897, may be wrong, which criminalized eunuchs as such. Well, that term became an umbrella term for, say, intersex people, transgender people. That's when criminality of transgender people became active in Indian legislation. So what the Indian community had in a thing is, it had two sides to all of the relationship. It had to transgender people, gay people, homosexuality. So there is depictions of homosexuality as far as the temples and pagodas in Pune, Tanjore. There's multiple depictions. There's depictions of women embracing other women, men embracing other men, men with their genitals in front of other men, and as such, there in Mahabharata there's a depiction of Shikandi, who is born female, raised male, as such, which was depicted then. However, there are also instances in Indian history, ancient Indian history, where, say, in the Arthashastra there was inclusion of homosexuality, but there was also instruction that the kings fight against homosexuality and punish those who indulge in homosexuality. But that also comes with the fact that there was a very mandated idea of sex, which was just procreative sex. India is the homeland to Kama Sutra. Despite that, India Indian history, a large part of Indian history does have a very mandated value of sex, which was procreative sex as the only natural form of sex, which was then used by many people as an argument for 377, which is now repealed. Punishment of homosexuality came as such that any sex which was not penile vagina intercourse, procreative sex, was unnatural sex. And thereby, the values of that became homosexuality to be punished. The thing is, there was punishment, there was social outcasting. The most vile punishment there was is that if a grown woman had relations with a younger woman, their head would be shaved and 2 fingers would be cut off. That was still existent at a point where there was also acceptance of homosexuality. Indian history has had much more visible representation of homosexuality as well as multiple gender identities. However, there has also been the flip part of it. But nonetheless, when the British came, they set back Indian history by miles. They set back Indian culture by miles, which set back the status of the Hijra community as gods and goddesses to criminals. But nonetheless, India's relationship to LGBTQ plus community has always been one hand forward and I elbow you back.
India is a country where the concept of coming out doesn't really exist. Since the community is so repressed, it is as if its people don't exist. Were you, as an individual, able to come out? And if yes, what propagated this? As an individual, I actually had a very hard time coming out because I wasn't living with my family. I was in a boarding school for about 6 years of my life. And while I had the support system of friends and teachers, I didn't really have the support system of my family directly there because they were in a different city. And I do think the general environment where I was in my part of India wasn't the safest environment for me to come out in. And the general outlook of everyone in my city at that point was very negative and very repressed. If anything, like, you did not know much about it. So when I came to terms with my sexuality, I was very conflicted and I didn't really have someone to turn to. And in India, something like going to a psychiatrist is not normalized. It's just, in fact, if you go to a psychiatrist, it's as if you're considered you're crazy or, there's something wrong with you. So just that aspect by itself just led me to deal with my inner turmoil by myself. When I did decide to come out, it was about 4 years after I realized, I'm not straight. And thankfully, when I came back home for my vacations from boarding school, my parents were always very open, as in, like, they normalized not being straight from a very young age for me. Like, back in, I think, 8th grade, when my dad sat me down, he's like, we need to have the talk, because you may want to have a relationship at this age, because you're growing up. And when he spoke about it, he was like, you may want to have a boyfriend, or you may want to have a girlfriend, and both are fine, but just remember, you need to focus on your studies. So I was lucky that my parents were open to it, but I did not have them around me when I needed to come out, primarily. When I came back and I finally did come out, I was thankfully in a very safe and loving environment where my parents encouraged me to be open about my sexuality and be comfortable with myself. When it comes to what propagated it, when I look back at the environment that I was in, I realized that there were a lot of my friends who wanted to come out, but also couldn't, because not only their environment, but also their families weren't accepting of it. And I realized that if I came out, it would, not only would it be something that would make me feel more comfortable and as if I'm not hiding something from other people, but I also realized that it would help other people and encourage other people to also come out, no matter what their environment is. Because at the end of the day, like, in a country like India, from my experience, I feel like a lot of people are just forced into heteronormative relationships as they grow older, such as an arranged marriage. And not being open about your sexuality could be damaging in a long-term aspect as well, like when it comes to that perspective. So I thought that if I came out, it would encourage others around me that, yeah, it's okay, like there's nothing wrong with not being straight. So I thought I should come out.
Actually, my parents guessed that I came out more than I had to tell them about it, because in the beginning I was never social. I never went out much. My friends were literally counted on my fingers. And I just stayed at home, did nothing. So my parents, plus I didn't fit the normal norms of having a girlfriend at a younger age. So my parents just questioned me one day as I was just lying in bed. Do you like boys more than girls? And I'm like, I don't know. And I was a kid, I was 9 years old at the point in time. I knew nothing. And then like, as time went on, I turned 14 and like, I started to find some boys attractive more than I started to find girls attractive. And then like, maybe I just do. So I told my mom that and she's like, yeah, it's fine, that's good. And my dad just said, that's good, I'm happy for you. And yeah, they've been very accepting of me, which is weird, but yeah. As a whole, I don't think Indians have it easy when it comes to coming up, because a lot of India is rural, so yeah, it's not easy. Because it depends on where you are, where you're brought up, where you're born, who your family is, how you're viewed socially plays a very big role. Because say you're part of a big business family or something, if you were to say come out and that became public, I don't think the family would be very happy with that, because that just puts their social status as a whole pretty low, due to the entire fact of a lot of higher, more elitist families still not believing that LGBTQ plus exists. They just don't want to accept it. To them, a boy is a boy and a girl is a girl, and there is no societal norms which can break that. On the other hand, if you have loving parents, a good environment to be brought up in, the school where you're allowed to be yourself and not fit into this mold of what the school wants you to be, it is a lot more easy to come out.
I've grown up in an environment that's very loving and very, like, it's always been like, we are accepted for whoever you are. So because that's just been ingrained into my brain because of like my parents, my friends, my family, I was very comfortable with just like one day walking up to my mom while she was cooking and just being like, hey mom, I'm bisexual. And like the reaction was great. She just stopped her cooking and she gave me a hug and she's like, I'm so proud of you for coming out. So it was a very wholesome moment, and I like because that was like the first time I came out to someone other than my sister, I was like very open to coming out to other people because like my first experience was a very good one. I feel like it was like a lot of my friends had come out more recently, and it was kind of like, oh, my friends are so comfortable doing it, and it was mainly like influenced by my friends. They were comfortable with it. I was more sure of it, so it was just that.
So I never really came out. I never came out of my own volition, that is. So I first told a few of my friends that I was gender fluid because I was still confused about my identity. And this was not the first relation to LGBTQ plus community. So I identified as pan, but I never came out as pan. I never told anyone that I was pan. It just, in conversation, it came up that I am attracted to guys too. This is back when everyone knew me as a guy, as a man. And so what happened is when around class 10, I finally decided that and realized that this is not who I am. I am not a man, no matter how much I try to be one. From as early as the 2nd grade, I've been trying to be a man. In 6th grade, I tried to work out and become more masculine. In 6th grade, that's too early to work out. But nonetheless, around class 10, I decided that this is not who I am. And to a few of my friends, I told them that I was gender fluid, which was more accepted. It was more accepted because more people didn't understand it. Because they thought that I'm just a guy with some feminine identity, which was fine to the liberal set mindset friends that I did have. It was funny that one of my best friends didn't take it well when I first told them that I am not cisgender. In fact, I told them that I'm transgender, not even just gender fluid. Despite trans umbrella is there in gender fluid, but that I'm a transgender female, that I'm a woman. He didn't take it well. Nonetheless, in a few months' time, they were fine. Because here's the difference with our generation, especially generations so viable to new information, who have the internet, who have an open mindset. In fact, so here's the thing, there's a very well said saying that if someone loves you, no matter what, they love you, right? But within my friends, I found a support system, like as coming out as such, telling them that no, I am this personality, I am this person that I am. But to my parents as such, I did not come out of my own volition. In fact, it came out of the fact that my parents found out certain things about me before I could tell them. And there was denial at first, but because the fact remained that my household is a religious household. And despite Hinduism having multiple cultural depictions of transgender people, the last 250 years, 270 years of it, Hinduism has turned to take it as more stigmatized than it actually is in scriptures, as you say. So risky topic to talk about, but politics and religion, when it comes to this, the thing is that it is about the power dynamic rather than what it is in their scriptures as such. It is about the fact that the marginalization helps them to stay in that status quo. So the general idea of my mom was that the first reaction was no, that's not possible. Nonetheless, in 3 days time, she realized that she does love me. That if I am so adamant about my own identity, I must know my identity. And then what she said was that I do not fully understand it, but I will support you because I love you. But when it comes to the outer society, I did not really come out. I did not post on Facebook saying that I am out, I am transgender. But what really helped me was Instagram. I started posting pictures in makeup, pictures in dresses, pictures, and slowly people started talking about it. Some people were really great, some people were not so much. The reason I did not come out publicly is that I was still scared of visibility. Well into people knowing that I was transgender, before me telling them that I was transgender, I changed my Instagram bio to transgender Indian, which was, I guess, coming out for me, but by then everyone really pretty much knew that I was transgender. So yeah, coming out was existent, non-existent for me. Nonetheless, I'm out now. So yeah.
With my family particularly, we had a very liberal outlook to all these things, and so from a young age I was always taught that it was okay to have these conversations, but like simultaneously somehow there's this huge like taboo about relationships in general and sex in general in India. And so what ended up happening was my parents sort of told me that like unless you're engaged to someone, we don't need to know about anything. And so that's just kind of the culture I grew up with at home, is that it was never a matter of discussion. What I was doing on my own personal time was not something that they were interested in. And I think that was fair. But on like the flip side of that, at my social life, it sort of made me want to tell people more. And like I was like, I want to tell you guys what's happening with my brain, and like I don't know exactly, but I think this is what I am and this and that. But what had ended up happening by that point is I'd already made a lot of friends in the school that I was in, and I'd already made a lot of contextual friends that didn't agree with the liberal mindset that I had and weren't necessarily open to the things that I was claiming to be. So coming out is sort of a harder process because, like, as I started coming out to my closest friends and things like that, they sort of responded to me in a way that discouraged me. There were people that tried to convince me that that's not true. There were people that like just told me they didn't understand and that they would rather I not talk about it ever again and stuff like that. And so that was hard because that's like where I was looking for support is my friends, and they sort of faded away. But I had other friends obviously come up that informed me that there was a community, that there was like people I could be with as I was, like I could be who I was with them, and they wouldn't necessarily like think twice about it. And I think that's like a really important thing to say is even if you're having like trouble coming out in your social like group and stuff like that, there's always going to be like a couple of people that will find you and take care of you and like look after you and stuff like that.
Do you believe you have found acceptance regarding your gender identity in India?
Yeah, I have found gender identity acceptance in India.
So I'm really lucky in the sense that I was like I identify with the gender I was born with, which is like I'm cis. I'm a like girl in my brain and my body and stuff like that. And so like that was really convenient for me. So like except for the normal like patriarchal rubbish that people have to deal with as females, as girls, as women, I didn't have to deal with anything except for that. So my gender identity was like okay. So India is a strange place because our culture pre the British basically was very, very open to the LGBTQ community, especially people that identified as that were intersex or identified as transgender. They were considered like very much a part of the religious community, very much a part of the social community. It's still there in some places, especially in South India, where like members of the intersex community or the trans community are considered holy, and they like have to come to the house during weddings. It's like you have to treat them like guests, which is obviously how you're supposed to treat everybody. But so they're given this like level of respect, but then at the same time they're not thought about in society. You can see like from our government's recent like the trans bill that got passed, they're not considered the same level of human as everybody else. So I think gender identity is a really hard topic to talk about in the Indian context because there could have been a point where we were a lot more liberal than we are right now. And right now is kind of really sad about those things because people are not accepted, and then it's not like a common thing not to identify with your gender. It's not something that's talked about nearly enough. And so I think a lot of people struggle with their gender identity in India, and more importantly, a lot of people don't even realize that it's okay to talk about that and that it's okay to ask for help and stuff like that because it's such a solidified system in all of our heads and brains and stuff like that.
I have.
Yes, I found acceptance. There are people in India who are accepting. I feel like in every country, it's not just India. There are people who are accepting, there are people who are not accepting. And it's not for me to say that, no, be accepting of me. I will change your opinion because I exist, so accept me, right? I don't want to force my opinion, but I do think it would be a happier environment if people were more accepting around me.
Tough question to answer right now, but socially, personally, I think yes, in my close-knit circuit, close-knit friends group and certain people, but say in a more wider context is such saying leading an everyday life, going out on the road, talking to people, just communicating, even going to a restaurant or going by a bus. I guess there is a certain level of acceptability where people just find it weird, find me weird, and in the sense that they're not used to it. They're not used to seeing me as I am, and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to address. They don't know how to converse. The thing about in India is that, in my opinion, um, LGBTQ plus community is existent but not visible. That is what it is with us. The thing is, when we compare it to the Western world, or if we compare it to our experiences of it, it seems visible because we have confident, and especially our generation has seen more out LGBTQ plus people and more advocacy of as such. There have been advocacy throughout, but the visibility has been constantly oppressed in the manner that we are visible yet invisible. Say for the transgender community, right? The Hijra community is a huge community. It's a community and a safe space for thousands of transgender people, transgender, intersex, non-people. And despite that, the knowledge of transgender people is non-existent in many places. People know that the Hijra community exists. They don't know what they are though. There is conceptions of what they are. In fact, there is a massive conception that people think that men dress up as women so that they can earn money. I'm sorry, they don't, that's not what happens. There is a sentiment in certain people that the Hijra community is existent to trick people into giving them money, force people into giving them money for easy way of employability. It's funny. But yeah, so visibility as such, say in 1999, supposedly the first Pride Walk happened in India, but the Pride Walk was called the Friendship Walk. Friendship Walk in 1999. It happened in Kolkata in itself. So that's not too far back, right? That is 2 decades. That's 2 decades. But the thing is that as much as we existed, as much as the LGBTQ plus community existed, they have been made to be seem invisible. Even when with the repealing of 377, the repealing of 377 had to be done through the virtue of privacy rather than existence, right? Like 377 had to be done through the virtue of that right to privacy. Like we exist, we are not criminal anymore because it is not the government's business to see what's inside our bedrooms. That's the position through which we had to fight to repeal 377, and not by just the fact that unnatural sex doesn't exist in consensual adults. That's it. Or any of that we're human beings, that's it. That was not the position. The position was that it is privacy law, not human rights. Privacy law came into human rights. If we're talking about visibility of LGBTQ plus people, we're visible but invisible, which is, I guess, which is, I guess, fair in the sense of like what I talked about invisibility, because there is so much less awareness, I guess. But again, it comes along with the fact that anything out of the heteronormative ordinary is weird to people. So acceptability, in the sense, is a volatile area. I can find acceptability in some places and find the exact opposite in others. I've been followed. I've been stopped on the street to ask out of nowhere what I am, and and in bus rides, I've had groups of men heckle me, which is very weird, given the fact that the perception of India, as I had and I still do have, is that there is a certain level of social acceptability of transgender people. There is definitely a certain level of social acceptability, but it is also limited to the fact that they will just ignore it. We're not really treated as individuals, rather than objects and aspects of stuff. We're either attributed religiously, which is fine. Religious attribution. In fact, religious attribution sometimes gives us a better position than our normal socio-political attribution. Either religiously or we're attributed to deviance. For a couple of years, we did have certain protections socially, if we're talking about, and legally we did have the right to self-determine for a couple of years. I'm still hoping that this doesn't come into legislation, the trans bill. So if I'm talking about acceptability right now, I don't know if I am, at least legally so, given the fact that I have to stand in front of certain people who are supposed to decide my identity and not me. Here's the thing, like, a cis person doesn't have to do that. Why do I? I guess if a cis person doesn't have to identify themselves and proclaim it and say that I am somehow valid through this checklist of yours, why should I have to? The thing is, before I came out and before I started transitioning, a lot of things went into my head, and online there was a lot of tips and tricks on how to get HRT done and all of that. I am still not on HRT because I've been nervous, and a lot of it has to do with bureaucratic, a lot of things, and even my therapist is kind of scared to deal with the legalities of it, and so I'm still not on HRT. But before even starting socially transitioning, not medically, but socially transitioning, get laser hair removal done, grow your hair out, and all. So your therapist will give you a notice of no objection certificate much easier. And the thing is, even when I didn't have to get SRS to identify as female, even then, I cannot afford laser hair removal. I cannot afford sexual reassignment surgery, and in fact, like, that is absurd that I have to go through such a painful, time-intensive, and expensive procedure to identify as female. That's what the trans bill right now puts on me. And even to identify as transgender, even to identify as a third gender, I have to some people who are not trans have to tell me that I'm trans or not. And the thing is, without makeup, I have visible features of masculinity. I have a 5 o'clock shadow. I have facial hair. I have huge shoulders. Now, how do I know that the person standing in front of me won't look at me and be like, you're not feminine enough? I have to think of it every single day that if I'm too masculine, if I'm too feminine, when I walk out of the house and I have a little bit of facial hair on my face, I have to make sure that I'm not too feminine. And I know it's internalized, a lot of it is internalized problematic stuff, but the thing comes down to it that I am scared for my life. I am scared because my security isn't assured outside. My security isn't assured. I don't know what if a group of boys see me and they think that I'm too masculine or too feminine to pass. What's gonna happen then? I travel alone. I lead my life alone, and I don't have that assurance of security. And now if the legislation too gives me that, if I have to think of if in order to change, I was supposed to change my name legally, my gender legally, coming new year. I was supposed to change my gender legally because I wanted to change my gender legally before I leave for college. Now the thing is, a lot of people right now, after the trans bill got passed in the Rajya Sabha, a lot of my friends are telling me that you need to get out of this country, you need to get out of this country, you need to go somewhere else. But the thing is that being an Indian transgender woman is my identity. I don't want to take refuge in somewhere else so that my identity is valid. I want to be an Indian transgender woman. I don't want to go through surgery to say that I'm a woman. Because and I'm privileged enough. That at some point I can afford it. At some point I shall have the money to afford it. And I'm privileged enough that at least I'm still staying at a home. So many trans people across the world, across India, don't have that privilege. Don't have that privilege of a home, don't have that monetary privilege, don't have that social privilege. I'm privileged enough that my surrounding is accepting, a lot of trans people aren't. And the government says that the current trans bill is for the protection of trans people. If this is the condition of trans people, having me speak about it, if the idea of that is protection of trans people, then the definition of protection is very flawed.
Were you able to come out safely? Have you ever experienced any violence or harassment?
I was able to come out safely. I haven't experienced any violence or harassment at any point. Like, all my friends are perfectly fine with me being pansexual. And yeah, they make jokes about it, but I do it too. It's fine. It's accepted. My parents are perfectly fine with me. All the people I know, my teachers are fine with me being pansexual, which is weird because that's not expected out of them. But they somehow knew and they're fine with that.
Has it always been like that?
I had this one teacher while growing up in class 10. He was not very accepting of me as like a pansexual person. But like, I was his favorite student. So I was his favorite student and I used to do really well in his classes and everything. But he never liked the fact that I didn't fit the societal norms of boy likes girl, not anything else. So yeah, that's just the only negative. But even then, he was way too nice to me for me to say that was a negative experience, so to say. Never did anything to make me feel like I was out of his good books and he didn't like me or anything like that. I have seen it happen to other people at times. Even though teachers don't have the same relationship to a student as, say, parents or friends, they still have a feeling of love towards the students no matter what. And a student, no matter how much they deny it, do crave a little bit of that love. So if that is taken away from them, and if the student starts to despise or, dare I say, hate the student, it would not have a positive effect on the mental health of the student at all. As a country, India is pretty backward in societal norms. Like, if you study sociology, there is this talking of community feeling, how togetherness is what defines a society. In India, that is a thing, but we as a community agree on very harsh topics. So this would be political, but the Ayodhya case has caused a lot of split decisions in Hindus and Muslims, and it's very, very one-sided on both sides of the argument. You can't accept, like, no Muslim is accepting of the fact that the Hindu temple can be built, and no Hindu person is accepting of the Muslim fact either. So it's very harsh in that way.
I would have to consider my circumstance at that moment. I would have to consider the people I'm with, that I'm surrounded with, and take a lot of other factors into consideration. Is it okay for me to say? Will someone get harmed if I say something? Will I get harmed if I say something? And then can I consider saying that, no, I'm polysexual, I'm not straight? I would say that I was able to come out safely, but I have definitely faced a lot of harassment when it comes to my sexuality. For instance, like, when I was in charge of something, there was a general argument about a certain incident. And a lot of people took advantage of that situation and used it to bring up their homophobic thoughts. And I was the center of that hatred. So that definitely affected me a lot. And when it comes to violence, I think I don't speak just for myself. Like, I feel like as an Indian, everyone has experienced it to an extent. It's only the degree which varies, but which I hope and I do think is reducing. For instance, came out involuntarily over here without planning it because a friend of mine just outed me by mistake to my teacher. And he was quite taken aback because right before he found out that I wasn't straight, he had made a whole speech about how he absolutely hates anyone who's not straight. He believes that there is no need for an individual to come out and be so loud and extra about it because it's just a normal thing. But the fact that we're, pushing it onto other people, because of that, he hated anyone who wasn't straight. And I was quite taken aback because I was scared and I didn't know how to respond to that situation. And at that moment, a friend of mine just outed me. He's like, "Oh, but she's not straight." And I was like, frozen, because what do I say? I had an argument after that with my teacher because that obviously affected me. As a student, I look up to my teachers and there's someone I find comfort in, but if they're the ones who can't accept me as an individual, I just think there's nothing as detrimental, right? So I sat down and I was like, why do you feel like this? What kind of logic is this to hate someone who's not straight? And straight up hate them. And I try to explain that the thing is, being in a heteronormative relationship or being straight is just so normalized that for people who are not straight, they really need to catch up from a while back to try and make people understand that, look, I'm not straight. And because of that, it seems like it's extremely loud, seems like it's extremely extra, but that's because our community's been repressed for so long. How else do you expect us to explain that, I am different and that's fine, but, don't subject me to your heteronormative norms.
I wasn't able to come out. I never particularly came out, right? But saying if I'm taking the thing of coming out as people getting to know that I'm transgender, it has been mixed because there were people around me who were extremely supportive. I had the privilege of that people around me were extremely supportive. But also, one of the reasons that I left one of my schools in class 10 and went into another school is that a lot of people there weren't. In fact, there have been instances of my Instagram posts being circulated around because of course it's a joke, right? And the thing is, even before coming out, right, I've always been ridiculed as a chakka, ladki, gay, and all of that. The way I walk, the way I talk, a lot of it was ridiculed forever, right? But once I came out and once people got to know that I was transgender, even after that there have been a lot of instances of harassment as per such. Physical violence wise, not as such, because I had the privilege of shifting to a school which had a safe space. Nonetheless, there was how do I say it? There was hate speech. There was definitely hate speech towards me, even in that school, from certain people as such. So even though there is not explicit physical violence in school as such, I did have a sense of lack of security. And if I say with regards to that, even people who didn't have explicit knowledge of me being transgender or as such, the suspicion of that led to a lot of instances where I was followed, where I was heckled, where I was physically harassed on the streets. The thing is, I don't know if this is common to trans people or not, but I'm sure it is. I am pretty sure it is for trans people moving around in anywhere in the world for that matters. That social, that that social lack of security is there everywhere in the world. In fact, sometimes it's better here, as far as I can like tell from the stories I've heard from people who are there and everywhere. The thing is, the thing with here is that the thing with at least Kolkata is that there is a culture of ignorance where there is both in the positive manner and the negative manner. Ignorance in the sense that yeah, I was followed and everything, but I have not faced active physical violence except for a few in one or two instances of physical harassment. And I'm sure there have been physical violences throughout India too. Like there have been instances of physical violence, but I haven't faced active physical violence. Harassment or so, yes. Specifically in India, as per my knowledge, violence and harassment usually comes one from ignorance, yeah. Two from the fact that it is a change in beliefs. It is something which contradicts their beliefs, contradicts their current beliefs and current state of power as such. There's a lot of violence which comes from the fact that by mere existing we are a statement, right? By mere existing we are resistance to the status quo, right? It's just existing as such. So there have been a lot of instances where there were hoaxes against trans women. There have been a lot of instances around India. There have been hoaxes against trans women which stigmatized them and then subjected them to public violence. So there were hoaxes spread around that which related them to pedophilia, which related them to kidnapping, etc., which turned out to be baseless claims, which was solely based because of the fact that there was a stigma around them already. It was very easy to manipulate public opinion towards them that malicious intent is involved in any actions taken, or malicious intent is involved just by the virtue of them existing. So that is definitely there, but in India as such, and so there is a misconception of religious value that transgender people are not supposed to be existent, right? So if you consider throwing out of the house and like people being kept out of the house, people being disowned from families as violence, yeah, that is definitely there. There's a conception that religiously it is against religion, given Hinduism, Islam, a lot of religions. So that is definitely there. Another thing there is violence from men. There's a lot of instances of violence for men where there is so here's the thing, in multiple colleges, I won't be naming colleges or anything, but multiple colleges around India, there have been instances of multiple trans individuals dropping out of college because there was violence incited against them by male students who were existent there. Now the thing is that what to blame here is maybe unclear to me, at least. Is it religion or is it just masculinity and the idea of masculinity portrayed by patriarchy, like the patriarchal value of what a man is supposed to be, what a woman is supposed to be, right? I have, in my personal experiences, there have been certain males who've been like, what's there inside your pants, right? And like, aisa kyun chalta hai, right? There have been instances, definitely. So that more than religious values, I would, in my opinion, ascribe that to patriarchal values which is existent in the society, in most societies right now. So yeah, and yeah, as per my experience, which has been mostly in India, yeah, that is there.
I feel as if most of it was very safe. Everything was safe, but at the same time, there have been like a few instances where people have like called me out for being bisexual, or I've always like gotten the, oh, you're bisexual kind of thing. It was like, oh no, I expect you of all people to be straight. That's been said to me so many times that it kind of like made me question it myself when I like initially came out. But at this point, I feel like it's more like, I'm bisexual and this is how it is. Like, you need to accept that. Yeah, it is very much there. I mean, a lot of my friends, they've been through so many like traumatizing events, and I remember there was this one time, one of my friends, she went for a pride march, and she was initially a male, but she's transgender, and there was a young boy. He was like around 12, and he'd gone for this pride march as well, but he was just so like inconsiderate and so aggressive towards her, and he was like hurling insults. And I remember like I was there with her, and she was just burst into tears. I feel like that was just such a sad thing, and I'm so like devastated that that still happens. And because like, I don't know, I just feel like it happens quite often, and that's like the worst part of it.
I never experienced any violence, but so like I said, when I came out as bi, I only came out to like a few people at a time, and so like that information spread largely without me knowing, and so a lot of people got to know that I was bi before I was able to tell them. And so what ended up happening is the biggest like stereotype around the bi community, especially bi girls, is that they're super promiscuous. Basically that I'll sleep with anyone if they ask nicely and stuff like that. So what happened wasn't necessarily a form of harassment or anything, but it was just an invasion of privacy where a lot of people assumed that my answers would be yes whenever they asked me to do anything. And then I also realized that a lot of people tried to attack me using my identity, because like it was presumed that I was bi and that's thus promiscuous. They sort of told people that they were sleeping with me and stuff like that, even though all those things weren't true. And that made me really uncomfortable and really unhappy for like a chunk of my life that I would have much rather it not happened. So I was really lucky in that I never faced any violence, but there's still like this strange understanding of what bisexuality is and what that means for everybody. It comes from misinformation. Like people often ask me whether like me being bisexual means I'm just constantly in relationships with 3-4 people at the same time. They ask me if it means I only engage in threesomes, like questions like that. And I think that comes from, a large part of that comes from sexualizing women and sexualizing bi women specifically, and all of the like media that I grew up with, like 2.5 Men, like The Big Bang Theory, like all of these shows and stuff like that always talked about how anybody that was bi, any women specifically that were bi, were obviously like sluts, and they would obviously like do whatever the guy wanted them to and stuff like that. So I think a large part of it comes from that, and then a large part of it comes from just not understanding what the queer community is that a lot of people just have a misconception about what we stand for as a community, and rather than like have everybody having the right to identify as what they want and being able to love what they want, a lot of people label the queer community as basically these like sex fiends that'll do like crazy stupid things and stuff like that. And so that's one part of it, I think.
Do you think there is a difference between the way the LGBTQ plus community is viewed in India in comparison to another country? For example, a liberal country versus a conservative country. Do you think there is a difference between the way the LGBTQ plus community is viewed in India in comparison to another country? For example, a liberal country versus a conservative country. Do you think there is a difference between the way the LGBTQ plus community is viewed in India in comparison to another country? For example, a liberal country versus a conservative country.
Do you think there's a difference between the way the LGBTQ plus community is viewed in India in comparison to another country, for example, liberal versus conservative countries?
Do you think there is a difference between the way the LGBTQ plus community is viewed in India in comparison to another country? For example, a liberal country versus a conservative country.
India can be considered more accepting of the LGBTQ plus community compared to a country like Philippines or Indonesia. Like those countries are quite strict with their laws and everything. And Japan, I think, as well. But at the same time, if you compare us to countries like the United Kingdom or America to some extent, we are a little like more conservative and backward. I feel like most of the time, like I personally at least, as like a member of the community, I compare our country to the Western world, where it's a lot more accepted. I don't really consider like the Eastern countries, and because of that, it's like, oh no, India needs to like, you know, progress more and like, you know, become more accepting, become more, make the members feel more like loved and valid. So I feel like it can have a negative impact, but at the same time, if you compare us to other countries like in the Eastern world, then we are a lot more out like forward and with our thinking and everything.
So I think if I were to compare India to say Thailand, right? Thailand's very open to the transgender community, and India is not. This is obviously, like, if you look back centuries ago, India was very accepting because in Hindu mythology there are a lot of transgender characters, and they're looked up as idols and gods and goddesses and so on and so forth, right? But today, if you look at the transgender community in India, they're all actually pretty much thrown out of their houses, and they're called the Hijra community. And a lot of derogative words are used when you describe the transgender community in India. In fact, it's so normalized. It's like, you know, if I say, oh, you're stupid, I could also say, oh, you chakka, because that's what means transgender in India, but it's a derogatory term, right? But in Thailand, it's completely, like, I feel, as a person who's been to Thailand and seen the transgender community over there, I think in comparison, it's just, they're normalized as just a part of society, and because they are a part of society and they are a normal part of society, right? Every society has a transgender community. So if I were to compare countries like that and see the differences when it comes to, say, the transgender community, there's a big difference. But at the same time, if I look at a more repressive country, of course I can say India is a lot more forward. India has removed certain laws and acts and is enforcing bills for our good or not. But at the same time, I can also say that no, we're way behind and we're all repressed. We all face a lot of harassment, and it's not a very positive outlook at all.
So, I think the general outlook in India towards certain people of a sexuality, there's a stereotype, for example, that gay guys are effeminate. So in India, regardless of the person's sexuality, if they behave effeminate in any manner, they're just immediately teased as, oh, you're gay, and it's very like derogatory, and in the sense that, like, if the person is actually gay, they will not want to come out at all, and that's very normalized in India. Like, using gay as an insult or using like chakka as an insult is just very normalized. I think that this behavior like stems a lot from the toxic masculinity that's there in India, which is the norm in India and is expected of the men over here. I don't know why that's a norm, because it really shouldn't be a norm, but it's enforced on especially male individuals. Of course, it's there on female individuals as well, but I'm taking the example of male individuals over here. But it's enforced on them a lot. So like, don't cry, go play sports, do you play football? And like the talk between, it's bro talk. Why are you, if a guy came to school wearing makeup, why are you wearing makeup? That's so gay. Like, that's the norm. In fact, the concept of like be a man in India is just or like be a woman, whichever way you look at it. It's just so like, there's no non-binary aspect to them in India, as in like there's no gender fluidity between the masculinity and femininity, the outlook towards masculinity and femininity in India, which is why I think the moment anyone even swerves from that norm, they're first off considered a person of the LGBTQ plus community, and then secondly, they're just isolated. They're just pushed away because they don't follow the norm. When it comes to non-binary individuals or just anything that's gender fluid. I just think that in India it's not normalized at all, to the extent that like everything is heteronormative, of course, but the usage of pronouns such as they, them just does not exist. Like, it's not that non-binary individuals or gender fluid individuals don't exist in Indian society. It's simply that they're not acknowledged, and the concept of someone using they them pronouns or like wanting to dress androgynous just kind of isn't looked upon at all. It's not even looked upon favorably. It's just not looked upon. It just doesn't exist. It's that repressed.
So the thing with relationship to and reaction to LGBTQ community across the world is almost everywhere it is very two-faceted. There is one visibility, there is one representation of it, and definitely one would say that the Western world would probably have higher rate of acceptance and whatever, but also if we see numbers and statistics and all of it, violence against them is also rampaging. And there is say the matters of inclusivity, there is always a battle of inclusivity, right? So when it comes to social inclusivity in India as such, there is lesser religious intolerance towards the LGBTQ plus community, I would say to Catholic intolerance, which was the matter of fact through which India got set back through and intolerance increased through the 200 years of rule of the colonialism, which was brought into effect in Indian culture. The rampant intolerance got introduced through colonialism. So I do think that's the difference that is been created by the Western world. And if you're talking about just liberal or conservative, the thing is that in my opinion, in nowhere perfect liberal conservative binary, and even values, like even people and individuals values asserted toward by liberal and conservative binaries. So like places, say South Asia has a cultural acceptance towards trans people, which hasn't been existent in say the Western world or in say Europe, etc. South Asia has had the cultural acceptance of trans people in a very outcasted manner in many places, yes, but still there is a community, there is a safe place for them, there is a safe space for them. Whereas there is definitely safe spaces everywhere else, but even till the 90s, the Western world did not see, even within the LGBTQ plus community, there was disparity between trans people and gay people, and outside the LGBTQ plus community, even though there was legislative changes in the Western world before India as such, a lot of violence against the LGBTQ plus community is unchecked, and a lot of attitudes towards LGBTQ plus community is unchecked just because it is the Western world, and it is what is known as the liberal world and all of it. But nonetheless, I would say, I guess legislatively India is behind. India has a way to go, because I guess mostly because of the fact that we were stuck upon certain rules and laws and legislations which were introduced by the British 200 years back, both when you come to gender and sexuality. We were stuck upon legislation which was based then, and which got ingrained into our culture through centuries of socialization, right? But say places like Thailand, right? There is a rate of acceptability which is good, which is high. So Thailand and Malaysia are bordering. There are people from Malaysia who go to Thailand regularly. There are trans people from Malaysia who go to Thailand regularly because it's more acceptable there, because it's criminal to be a trans person in Malaysia under certain legislations, not all legislations, but certain legislations. But again, the thing comes to it that even in Thailand, right, there is stigmatization of trans people. So the thing with LGBTQ plus community everywhere, there is common assertion and idea of the LGBTQ plus community as how much of an inclusive it is. There is certain aspects and of society which still consider them as abnormal, and more than like not including them, more than like not acknowledging that that we don't exist. They acknowledge that we exist, but they acknowledge us as outcasts, like attributing trans people to just prostitution, because which is a fact, because we do have to resort to that. There is a lot of trans people who do have to resort to a lot of things, and out of by choice too. And it doesn't matter what that is, but the idea of trans people just ascribed to prostitution is still there in a lot of parts of the society, even in places where being trans person is very much accepted. Words such as lady boy has been used for me, and the thing is that if you see socially, right, the word lady boy is a very westernized term, which was ascribed to trans people through trans people's ascription to prostitution, and that and I have been called it out myself. What always look down before you go through with it. If someone is engaging in any sexual acts with me, always look down before you go through with it. That has been said. That has been said by people in India as such. No matter where in the world, right, liberal, conservative. Obviously, there is disparity between the status of trans people, between status of LGBTQ plus people, but I would say that there is definitely still a long way to go. There is definitely no perfect liberal environment yet, and there is definitely good sides in India and bad sides in India, both socially and socially. Politically, I'm not politically right now, politically and legally right now in India, I would say there is India is behind. India is behind politically and legally as for making an actual safe place for LGBTQ plus people. There is no anti-discrimination laws for LGBTQ plus people. The recent trans bill says that there are anti-discrimination laws included in it, but it also is regressive in so many manners, right? And so that is still there. So yeah, we have a long way to go. But socially, I wouldn't say that it is on the opposite end of a liberal society.
Yeah, there will always be a difference in how any topic in the world is viewed in one country compared to another. And for example, say there's North Korea. North Korea is one of the strictest countries in the world. You can't do anything out of the law. You can't be free. Your freedom is restricted. Everything you do, say, speak, think also to an extent is restricted. North Korea is easily the least forgiving country in the world. And I'm very sure, even though I have never heard of a transgender thing, I'm pretty sure it's because they don't allow it to even blossom as a flower. It's never allowed to exist in North Korea. India, on the other hand, is a lot more accepting and a lot more open-minded towards LGBTQ to an extent, that is. You just can't have a country perfectly alright with everybody accepting something, because that's not how the human mind works.
So, I have a lot to say about this. So, obviously, yes, there's a big difference in the way the LGBTQ community is perceived. But I think what's really interesting is that mostly in India, that it's like split up into two perceptions of it. And while the LGBTQ community is one like sort of united front in a lot of Western countries like the United States and the UK and stuff like that, in India it sort of gets split up between like sexuality and gender. So like I said before, the idea of gender in Indian culture is very like different than it is in a lot of Western culture. In fact, our understandings of gender binary and stuff like that only sort of came in post the British, post colonialism, where they told us this is what things are supposed to be, and blue and pink and boys and girls. And before that, it didn't really exist. So a lot of our like religious scripts, a lot of our like cultural heritage, like all of these things are really like accepting of non-binary gender identities, whereas the idea of sexuality as a like label and like as a like same-sex partners and stuff like that was less common at that time. And so what has ended up happening is now, although the LGBTQ community is a like united front in India now, there's still that split between the understanding. So for example, I can relate this to my own family. It's like they are the larger extended family is a lot more understanding of somebody that would identify as transgender or somebody that was born intersex and stuff like that, because it's something that they were able to grow up with. It's something that they understood through their scriptures. Like during the Mughal times and stuff like that, there's a lot of like the most famous like women and the most famous courtesans and stuff like that were actually trans women or like intersex women, people that identified as women. And so what ended up happening was, like in my family at least, and I think speaking to the larger culture, is that kind of side of things got more accepted than the sexuality. So like a boy kissing a boy is less acceptable to my context than somebody that identifies as trans. But although I understand that that might not be true for everybody, that's my understanding of it. And so when you have this like weird strange split, what ends up happening is both like legislatively and socially, you start treating them as separate groups of people, which I don't think happened on such a like strange scale in the West. In a lot of more liberal countries, you can see the progression of like trans rights and then gay rights and then like same-sex marriage and stuff like that, and that happening in this sort of linear fashion. Whereas in India, it's sort of all hodgepodge and like mixed up. And so there's a lot of people that I think would be a lot more understanding of things if you actually sat them down and explained it to them. But on a cultural level, it's been so ingrained in us to think of everything else as other and not correct that that's kind of become the norm now. Another thing is largely in the West, the difference between India and large parts of the West is the difference in perception of like sex and sexuality just in general. The West sort of had this like revolution, like a sexual revolution almost during the 80s and 90s, where the dirty dancing and like different things like that sort of became a lot more prominent and a lot more acceptable. So over there, it became acceptable for even like just non-same-sex relationship partners to be holding hands on the street. There's people kissing and stuff like that, like kissing in high school and stuff like that, which is like much more accepted there. Parallel to that in India, that sort of like progression didn't occur. And so even today, like a girl and a boy holding hands walking down the street could get attacked and like properly reprimanded by the police and stuff like that. And so obviously that's made it a lot harder for the LGBTQ community, because when you have a country that's not even willing to talk about sex in the same place, how are they going to talk about like variations of sex and like how to understand like that people can have different definitions of this thing if you just are not perceptive to like talking about it in the first place on a legal or like on a social level. And then apart from that, another thing that's really interesting in India is while our culture is so accepting, the political opposition is very, very strong. But what has ended up happening is because of this, like for example, in the 90s, we had our first Pride parades in Kolkata and stuff like that. And so what's happened is that's also become ingrained in our culture. And so the police have to give us protection. There's certain things that have to happen. Like there's the violence in riots and stuff like that never really took place in India because it's so ingrained in our culture that that sort of peaceful protest and the existence of the LGBTQ community, that regardless of how much the political parties are in opposition to us existing,
we still have a very like clear voice and a clear like heritage in the country itself for us to take our stand and say that yeah, we do exist, like what are you going to do about it, that kind of thing. Now, I think that's a interesting part of being part of the LGBTQ community in India, and it would have been much more interesting to see during the 90s and stuff like that when all this stuff was starting out in the first place. But especially now, like 3 decades later, there is a lot less like room for military oppression or like, you know, the police doing lathi charge or something like this on a group of people that claim to be LGBTQ and are protesting.
What ended up happening in the West was there were a bunch of riots, there were a bunch of protesters and stuff like that that came up in the 50s post a lot of oppression and stuff like that, because that was part of their culture at the time. And so when the protesters came up, there was this sort of initial public resistance to it, and then slowly over the decades, like there was this gradual change towards acceptance, which is like you can see it like very clearly, the difference between the way the LGBTQ community was portrayed in Western media in the 50s versus the 90s, or even the 70s versus the 90s. You can see this like very gradual but very like prominent change in the amount of respect given to the members of the community, and then also the amount of representation that the members of the community had, right? But what ended up happening in India was, because there was a restriction on the media that we were able to consume, there was this like, if you talk to our parents' generation, they'll tell you when they were growing up, they only had one TV channel and they had to watch this one news program that would show one movie every 2 weeks. And so they only had this very limited exposure to what was going on in the West, and they only had this very limited exposure to what was okay and what wasn't okay. And so for a long time post colonialism, we sort of stuck with the beliefs that the British had put on us in the 1850s, which is that anything that's not heteronormative and cis is basically wrong. And while the British and the Americans got to gradually work through that belief system and whatever, get to this point of acceptance in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, this was sort of just slammed on India. So suddenly we had all these news channels and like media culture and stuff like that that was showing us that, oh, this is okay. Like one of the most popular TV shows in the early 2000s, Friends, had this had like a character come out as lesbian, and while she was like still reprimanded greatly on the show, and while it was still like terrible the way they treated her by today's standards, in that context, for that to have been showing in India at that point in time was really jarring to our parents' generation, really jarring to their parents specifically. Is like, what is this like? And then the LGBTQ community sort of got entangled with this party culture that the West seemed to have. And so a lot of people's perception became that being part of the LGBTQ community means they were these sort of partiers and only liberal, Western culture loving people type situation. And then what ended up happening post that is like with our generation specifically, is that we had this like broadening of media considerably to what our parents had when they were growing up. And so we have Instagram, we have YouTube, there's people coming out constantly, like there's like shows on Netflix like Queer Eye that are like showing us what the LGBTQ community looks like. And so when that becomes normalized pop culture, when there's people singing on the radio about girls kissing girls and stuff like that, I think our generation has a much better chance at becoming a lot more like accepting of the community, and our generation is a lot better off in that manner, whereas our parents' generation didn't necessarily have those opportunities and that exposure. While our political party currently, like the leading political party, the BJP currently, is very, very adamant about what Hindu beliefs are and Hindu rights are and stuff like that, what has ended up happening over years of suppression and years of neglect in the LGBTQ community is that we've sort of grown a culture for ourselves and grown a community for ourselves from the ground up. And so the years after independence and the years leading up to like this extremely right-wing government has sort of made it so that even though like socially,
culturally we're not accepted as a part of the larger social community, we've still already had these like stands, and we've made these like sort of pockets of society for ourselves, which is really interesting to look at, because you have like our people are apparently democratically electing this super right-wing government, and yet there's this like insane divide between what's actually happening on the ground, which is like recently there have been like LGBTQ community cafes opening up in Kolkata, all these things. So it's just this huge divide between cultural and political, which is that the community has made itself so visible and so present and so there that it's hard for the political parties to oppress us in the same way that they could have had it in a different context. Not that they aren't doing it anyways, it's just that we have made it conceivably much harder for them by just existing.
If you're comfortable talking about it, do you feel that coming out in India has affected your mental health negatively or changed the outlook of society towards you in a negative manner?
Right. So, like I said before, coming out was a really strange process for me. But what was interesting about that, I think, is before I'd even considered that I was not straight, I already knew all the bad things that were associated with it. So, as a adolescent, like 11, 12 years old, you're already exposed to all these cultural ideas of what it is to be LGBTQ. And so you're already told that you can't be these things because it means you're this, this, and this, and those are all terrible things to be. And that's not how we've raised you, or that's not what this society requires right now. And so I already knew all the repercussions to it, and I already knew what exactly would be said about me if I decided to come out, which is why I think I didn't come out for a really, really long time. And I was constantly in this battle of, oh no, what if I lose my friends, and what if nobody accepts me for who I am, and what if nobody even understands what I'm trying to say to them. And this was, I think, backed up by a lot of the horror stories I read on social media, because at that age I suddenly had a Tumblr and an understanding of where LGBTQ communities went to talk on social media. And so I would read these stories of all these people being like, oh, I came out and it was a disaster, and my family kicked me out, and I have nowhere to live and no friends anymore.
And so reading those stories, I think, sent me into this almost perpetual state of panic, where I didn't want to come out. I was just very, very reluctant to do it. And I think that's what impacted my mental health a lot, because when I did decide to come out, I only came out to a very select group of people until very, very recently, last year, where I came out to all the members of my school Gender and Sexuality Alliance by accident. I just sort of declared that I was bisexual, and everybody was like, oh, okay. But before that, all of my experiences coming out to my friends and stuff like that was met with a lot of hesitation, and met with a lot of one person stayed on the phone with me for 1.5 hours trying to convince me that I wasn't bisexual and that it was just a stupid thing that I was thinking right now. And so that was sort of the materialization of 5-6 years of me just panicking about what's going to happen. So I think that way it did affect my mental health, because I became much more reluctant to talk to anybody. And when you start bottling things up and keeping things within yourself, they start affecting you more and more and more, which is why it was almost a relief for me to come out, because I came out very, very late, compared to when I knew I was bi. And I think the people that I was concerned about, who didn't want to be my friends and things like that, I think they ended up sort of not treating me the same way. And I just had to sort of come to terms with that. So I think larger society will look down on you. And the thing is, I still haven't come out fully publicly. I don't have my sexuality on my Instagram. I don't have it on Facebook or any social media where it's
where you can see it if you're not part of my social group. Because in India specifically, I think what's really concerning is there's no laws to stop you from like discriminating against people of the LGBTQ community. So I could not get a job simply because I'm LGBTQ, and I could like not get into college because I'm LGBTQ. So I'm not properly out as yet because of all these social repercussions that would take place that I know will happen. Like, it's not a matter of questioning anymore. I've learned from other people's experiences, and I understand the repercussions that it has to be LGBTQ in India specifically, today at least. And so like I think coming out is a process that is ultimately relieving, but at least initially very, very harrowing, or it was for me. And I think it's really important to remember that you don't have to come out, you don't owe it to anybody, especially if you think that it's going to affect your future and how your mental state of being is.
I feel like coming out in India has definitely affected my mental health for the worse. But I don't entirely blame India for that. I do think that it's just the norms, the societal norms in India in general need a little bit of work on it. For example, like you look at the gender roles in India, they're so heavily enforced. It's it's so normal that your mother has to be a housewife and your dad has to be the breadwinner. Again, it has to be mom and dad. It can't be mom and mom, or like a dad and dad, or just two non-binary parents. The norms in India in general that cause the negative outlook on the LGBTQ plus community, which affected my coming out negatively.
But I definitely think that no matter which country, unless of course it's a life or death situation, it could be safe, it could be unsafe to come out, but if that's what you feel will put your heart at peace, put your mind at peace, then you should go for it. So it may have affected my mental health negatively. There could have been a lot of factors to it, and I don't blame just India for the impact it had on me. But I feel like regardless, if it helped me to come out, then I should come out. When it comes to the change in the outlook of society towards me, again, it's to an extent, it's a yes and no. I think that for some people, it's definitely worsened my image to them, as I'm no longer a heteronormative human being, and I'm no longer their normal. And they find that hard to digest, they find that hard to accept, and in return, I get a lot of negative emotions.
So I think that in some circumstances, I don't think that it's changed the outlook of society towards me in a negative manner, because for a lot of the LGBTQ plus community, or even for a lot of individuals who are supportive of the LGBTQ plus community, they will look at it positively as, look, this is someone who is a part of our community. This is someone who is, just living their life and she's happy about it. So for that, I think it's a positive outlook. It's subjective.
There has been one specific incident that did affect me mentally to an extent. It was once when I was trying to come out to my friends with the fact that I was pansexual and like I wasn't completely normal to an extent. And one of my friends just went, I know he meant it as a joke, but he just made a derogatory comment on my sexuality as a meme from TV serial. I know he meant it in good terms, but as a 15-year-old, you take a lot of things pretty badly, and I drifted apart from that friend for about a year and a half. I got back together with him recently, but like, I just got affected by that one friend because I trusted him more than basically everybody else. But that incident strengthened me further, and then I learned to take criticism, and hurtful comments more easily, and then it stopped affecting me altogether, and now everything's pretty perfect. There's a lot of satire in TV serials as well. Like they do joke about that as well. So that encourages like our younger generations who watch such TV serials to say it randomly as a joke, and they think it's funny or satirical. And as you grow up and you become more mature, you learn to accept that and just move on with your life. But also, it can be put down to the fact that we have a very in-the-box outlook on society as a whole. As in, the whole thing of up until what, 2016, I'm pretty sure if you saw a boy wearing pink, I can assure you he would be hated basically if you walked on the streets like that. And it doesn't affect me whatsoever because I used to wear pink since I was literally a kid, and pink is literally my favorite colors. So yeah, but it does affect a lot of people, but they just have to get used to it because there is nothing stopping them from saying you can't say that, but also they don't want to get into that whole wheel of yes I can, it's funny, it's not meant to be serious. Why don't you just learn to take a joke? Because that just goes back and forth to the point that both parties get so distracted and disjointed from what they're actually talking about that it can get very hurtful. Like they can go on to families and stuff, which just does not end well for either side. So they just learn to accept it and move on because arguing never lands a person in a good place. As males, we are brought up to be the superior gender and the people who are supposed to run the house basically. We own the money and everything. We're dominant. We fight the wars, all that. And there is no forgivingness for a person who isn't that aggressive and that dominating. If you aren't that, it's more of just society wanting you to be like that. They just want you to be a man, so to speak, because boys are boys and men are men. That's how society tells you to be. But if you're not like that, society doesn't consider you a man for some reason. But if you do just do some inner searching inside yourself, you do find out your own gender and your own identity as a person, and it does become a little easier for you to come out to people that you know and love when you are sure about who you are and what you want in life. But still, every country, not just India for a fact, don't generally accept men to come out very easily. It is progressing, but it's not sure thing ever.
Honestly, overall, I don't think so. But I feel like there have been certain instances, like even in school, where it's just had an effect on like the way I've looked at other people. It's kind of like there was this one incident where a boy, a tiny bit older than us, he meant it in a joke, but he said something about bisexuality not being real, and that really affected me for quite a while. Like it happened 2 weeks ago or something. But it still like really affected me. Like, yeah, I know it was a joke and he meant no harm, but at the same time, like hearing that and coming out quite recently as well, it really hurt me, like in all honesty, and it made me feel so invalid. Like I burst into tears that day. It was terrible. I feel like it is quite common, but that's more to do so with like colonization, I'd say. So in India, like before colonization, we were like, if you go through like the ancient scripts, like the Vedas, like being transgender and like being a part of the LGBTQ plus community was very normal. It was extremely normalized. But after colonization, like the Western influence was like it just set in homophobia, and it was very negative. And I feel like a lot of people still haven't gotten out of that mindset and are struggling to do so.
Okay, so the answer to that, in the sense like, so coming out overall has affected me positively, for sure. I'm living in my truth. For so long, I was closeted I did not accept myself. I hated myself. For so long, I did not like myself and did not like who I was because of a fact which was ascribed to me by other people. And so coming out overall has definitely affected me positively because I am who I am and I am in acceptance right now, and I have accepted my, and I'm confident about it. I feel good. I am a woman. I'm a transgender woman. And but um, coming out does have its own negative sides to it. Say if I see it like that, yeah, certain things of my mental health has been affected by coming out in India. But I couldn't say it for sure that it is coming out in India that did that, right? Because I don't have the experience of coming out abroad. Now, the idea from an Indian perspective would be that maybe coming out abroad would be easier. Maybe coming out abroad would be easier, but I cannot vouch for that. What I can vouch for is that coming out for me and being visible as I am. The negative aspects of coming out there was that there was a lot of bunch of people who were actively against, say, their entire, as they called it, ideology, right? And my identity being their ideology, like that's so. And there have been multiple instances of social media harassment, but there have been also a huge amount of support in social media. As I said, I found my safe haven in Instagram, which is weird, but yeah, I did, and a lot of people did support me in through social media and all of it. But a lot of people did also harass me, and on the streets and as such. And the thing is, with coming out came my transition, right? My coming out was not just verbal and not just, say, a matter of knowing. It was that my visibility changed. I was not walking around like a dude anymore, right? I was not trying to be a dude anymore. I was not trying to be a man anymore. I am myself, and that is different from what people have seen me for almost 15 years, 16 years. And I'm but I'm also privileged enough to be able to socially transition at such a young age. Like, I'm also privileged enough that, like, I went to my school prom in a dress. It was very nerve-wracking. But I had the privilege to do that. So I guess coming out did affect me both positively and negatively. But I think um, there was bound to be the negative effects, right? There was bound to be the negative effects, but nonetheless worth it. Again, being in a more liberal space, liberal environment, and in a more liberal school as such, certain people's outlooks didn't change. But say in so with me coming out, the thing is like the since I didn't like come out properly and make a full big public announcement of coming out or any, as such, my coming out was very gradual. That like many people got to know slowly, and many people got to accept slowly too. A lot of people in the beginning were averse to the idea that my identity is not what they knew from before. A lot of people were definitely averse to that idea, and I have lost a lot of relationships that way. I've lost a lot of friends that way, that who were not comfortable with the idea of that. But and a lot of people were like, that's just weird, right? And which was definitely negative reaction to me being myself, right? But overall, if I say, the thing is, ever since I started transitioning, I became a more personal person, as in I became a more close knit, restricted to close knit people person. So what I chose to do is try to block off and ignore the negative reactions which were there towards me. In the sense, if I look at the wider society, if I look at the wider society and people who don't know me and who people just passing me on a road, right? Definitely I get stares all the time on in the road. Which I definitely didn't get before I started transitioning. I get all of the heckling, all of the stares, all of that comes with the fact that I started transitioning, and I know that. And also the fact that my gender presentation now is female. So yeah, men don't get stared at, like, mostly. Like, so that's from my perspective, that I, till the age of 17, I presented myself very masculinely, the idea of masculinity, how it was, I presented myself that way. So there was definitely a change of people's behavior towards me and how people acted towards me. And a lot of times there is the whole, in say school or such, a lot of times there's the whole purview of, I don't know how to react to you, the whole aspect that I'm not aware enough. But the thing is that I don't care about being aware enough to react to you well, or as such. So that's how I've lost a lot of friends and I've lost a lot of relationships. But there has also been very positive reactions too. There has also been like, you look so beautiful now. You look much happier. And that is true. I am much happier than I was. And that is a reaction that I found, at least in some people, in a lot of people as such, in a lot of people here. And I was privileged enough to find that environment around me and find a safe space. I did change schools in order to find safe space, and I did find my safe space, so I was privileged enough to get that.
Okay. Thank you.